Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Thanks for taking out the time to join this session. And on behalf of the Nina Jojer and partners, American Business Council and York University, would welcome you to this webinar on how data enables and constrains AI development in Africa. My name is Joseph Ishi, the Business Development Manager for Nina Jojer, a policy and strategy consulting firm. So I will just give an overview of the sessions we'll be having. First is the opening remarks, which will be done by Honorable Dr. Chukwemeka Ujam, MNI, and also he is also the managing partner of Nina Jojer, and then Ms. Olele, the CEO of the American Business Council. And then followed by the fireside chat with the DG of Emerging Technologies and Innovation for the Ministry of ICT Rwanda, Ms. Esther Kunda, rather, sorry. And will be moderated by Honorable Jam MNI. Then the last session is the panel session, which will be moderated by Dr. Jude Kong. And the speakers include Professor Olayinka David West, who is the Associate Dean of Lagos Business School, Nigeria Sambuli Carnegie Endowment Fellow of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Rob Floyd, the Director of Innovation and Policy, Digital Policy for Africa Center for Economic Transformation. I got that right. And then Davy Uwizera, the CEO of Uza Labs for Rwanda, Kenya. And lastly, John Odokpolo from Microsoft. So over to you, Honorable Jam.
Good afternoon, everyone from Nigeria. Good morning, wherever else you are. I am Honorable Dr. Chukwemeka Ujam, MNI, the Managing Partner of Nina Jojer Limited. On behalf of the team and partners, I thank you for joining this session. Welcome to what I believe will be an interesting discourse that seeks to understand and throw more light on how big data enables and constrains AI development in Africa. Of course, there are a plethora and vista of opportunities that AI presents, and AI is not new to us as we have interfaced with this in the telecoms, cybersecurity, and finance space to develop products or tools that meet the needs of users. So this remarkable boom, to my mind, in the capabilities of large language models, foundational models, and related forms of generative AI has propelled these discussions on existential risk into the public imagination, and I dare say, into the inboxes of political leaders. But for us to develop these applications, we have to consider the repository of data and quality of data sets we have developed in respective countries and sectors. While we call for guardrails of AI development, we should also look at fostering innovation, and in the African context, how we can use these technologies to drive development and inclusivity. For example, our report, which will be shared in this chat, highlights how it can be deployed in the healthcare space, leveraging the already available data within various institutions. So also the report on AI for economic transformation by the African Center for Economic Transformation, which highlights key opportunities of which central banks and various tax agencies could use their own repository of data to drive efficiency and economic policy making. These are a few points that I want to highlight, and I will now hand over to Ms. Olele to share her perspectives before we go into the next session. You're welcome once again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ujam. Just to mention that, just to stress that American Business Council, for those who don't know who we are, is the American Chamber of Commerce in Nigeria and the voice of US companies. And we work to drive conversations that can help enhance the growth of both countries and the interest of the over 80 companies that we have as members. So looking at the conversation today, which is the big data, and welcome everyone. I believe Dr. Jam and Mr. Ishia have done the welcoming, but I'll add my voice to the welcoming as well. So AI, technology, big data, these are conversations that don't usually occur in beer parlors or, these are conversations that are meant to be, or are seemingly meant to be academic, but reality is that it affects every aspect of our existence. And I recall that, years ago, I sat on a panel and we were discussing how companies or NGOs can be a bit more sustainable patient groups. And one of the things that came out very strongly is how they are able to work with data in a way and manner that can help, make whatever they do sustainable. And it's interesting to note that Nina Jojer has done a great work in the area of big data and healthcare. So, but just to also mention that, we keep referring to one landmark in our existence, which is the COVID pandemic that happened, and obviously we still have some small instances, but that really accelerated opportunities in using technology to help think and work as humans. And we note that I think there was a PwC report that said that 52% of companies accelerated their AI adoption plans because of the COVID crisis, and that 86% is making AI a mainstream technology in the organizations. So this has changed the way people work, companies work, governments work, and even marketing strategies around what we do. And so, I mean, this is not peculiar just to every other part. Africa is part of the world, and this is also happening in the continent. So today we are discussing, how big data enables and constrains AI growth in Africa. It's really important to understand and define Africa's digital growth within the next decade. Looking at this conversation and putting it in foregrounding it in a sense, especially as we look at this from the point of view of the AFCFTA. We have seen a lot of work being done by some countries in terms of putting together, because now, I mean, I'm going to be looking at, at some point, how our countries looking at these from a point of view of a national policy. And I know that, a country as small as Mauritius, did some national strategy on AI, and then Egypt, and interestingly Rwanda. Well, from my perspective, and I think this is where I would tee off, I believe that individual strides may be exemplary within the continent, from a countrywide basis. But perhaps as we begin to have these kinds of conversation, we should also begin to think of a continental strategy required for the continent, especially as we lean on AFCFTA to get this done. I believe that these conversations may trickle out from different points, but I believe that there's a lot more we can do moving forward. And at this point, so that I don't, perhaps say more of the things that some of the speakers will be saying, I would hand this back to Joseph. Joseph, over to you.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Honorable Jam.
Okay.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you for your insightful comments, and of course, that to me sets the tone for the next session. So in this session, which is titled AI Development and Deployment in Africa: Opportunities, Challenges, and Case Studies, may I humbly welcome Esther Kunda, the Director General of Innovation and Emerging Technologies at Rwanda's Ministry of ICT and Innovation. Esther Kunda will delve into the Rwandan National Policy Strategy on AI, and it is hoped she will explore best practices, current challenges, and opportunities for big data and AI development from an African perspective. May I welcome you, Esther Kunda?
Thank you very much, and thank you for welcoming me and for the invitation to this interesting conversation. And I would really start by echoing what from my colleague who were talking about some of the challenges and what we might be seeing, and I think that's correct. So maybe to just completely go into the journey of Rwanda on AI specifically. Recently this year, Cabinet of Rwanda approved an AI policy. And the policy in itself, I'll just talk about the intent and what's in that policy. And most people would think it was at the height of ChatGPT, and now AI coming into the mainstream media, and everyone saying, how does AI affect me, my job and my future, etc. Today, Rwanda's AI policy, some of the key components that it really looks on, it's about around 6 pillars. And the main one is around skilling. What we are looking at is how do we build a 21st century skill talent within Rwanda and across Africa in general, to be able to first have enough talent who are knowledgeable about AI, can be able to build the models that we want, and the models that actually contextualize to Rwanda and Africa in general. But secondly, on the skilling part is also to look at reskilling and upskilling various people and people in various types of jobs. So we all know there's a lot of jobs that are currently being affected by AI and AI coming into their day-to-day job, and there's a need to really emphasize on reskilling and upskilling people who are in those jobs. It's a very, very important one, especially in Africa where the unemployment rate is already high. How do we make sure that that the jobs that are not the new jobs that are coming onto the market because of AI, actually people are ready to take them up. The second part is building a robust data strategy, and I think that's also feeds into the conversation of today. It's really to think about when you're building AI tools, AI solutions, AI-based solutions, what data are you using? Does that data have the context of Rwanda? Or does it have enough? Understanding or access to the right data sets? So that's one of the key elements that we want to focus on, and there's still very big challenge on how we address that. We still have. Fortunately, a few years back, we worked with Mozilla to create voice data sets in Kinyarwanda. And from that, different companies are leveraging on that open data sets to build, whether it's solutions using deep speech, text to speech, speech to text solutions, etc., to leverage that. We are lucky on that, but still we don't have enough data sets to be able to contextualize some of these things. But what we've also been doing is understanding especially within government, how do we start creating systems, having clean data, having reliable data that we start collecting, that we start cleaning, we start anonymizing, and eventually put out there for research and for solution development. The third part is around compute capacity, and I think as a small country,
Esther, if I may butt
yes.
in, I have some specific questions, and I wouldn't want you to miss some of the questions I have in your intro. So, for instance, just tagging on your immediate comment, around the issue of destructive AI, which is so pervasive right now. There's actually that fear. So I missed that AI surge. How does Rwanda, led by its ICT ministry and the sister agency, your RURA, the Rwanda Utilities Regulatory Agency, aim to uphold ethics, human rights, and diversity in AI design and deployment? How will they mitigate these risks, data privacy concerns, security bias from huge generative AI platforms, and ensure accountability? So how are you doing that within Rwanda?
I think there's twofold. One, under the SEM policy, we do have ethical guidelines that we've put in place, and we're actually disseminating within the ecosystem for people to understand where does the government come from when we're thinking about AI implementation. So I think that's the first one, and we've put them as guidelines as we get to understand and as we get to upskill even government employees on how to understand AI, to understand AI and the existing technologies that are today in the world and being used. The second part, and again I'll couple it, is again on data, is really fast tracking how fast we can get the right data out into the ecosystem. And that's very, very important. The third part, luckily, we last 2 years ago, we passed the data protection and privacy law, which is one of, and it's going to effect by the end in October this year. And with that law, what we are looking at is really on the data part and privacy for people, et cetera, to ensure that people are compliant within that aspect. So that's where we've started, but I think there's still a very big journey for us to bridge in terms of how we understand, or how some of these in creating and having data sets available for people to actually use, and then you can go back and see OpenAI, why is your ChatGPT providing the wrong information? But for me, my other question that I always ask is the right data set out there in the world? If it's not, so then who should be putting it out there for the world and for these models to actually be trained on?
So I think it's interesting that you do mention that you've recently passed into law your data protection bill or act. That's the way forward as we see across the globe. But during the formulation of your national AI strategy, could you share the insights gained from the learning process, and by so doing, offer guidance to fellow colleagues across the continent who are engaged in crafting AI strategies to steer their respective development efforts?
I think one of the few learnings that we really had was, for example, when we were thinking about compute capacity, there's a very big gap between what kind of compute capacity we can actually have here in Rwanda and what robust AI solutions that are currently on the market would be able to use, et cetera, and that in one part conflicts with existing data and protection laws, in not having the right compute capacity to ask people to actually train their data in country, and especially with the let me call it proliferation, but I don't know if it's the right word, of cloud and using cloud actually to do some of this compute. So those are some of the one of the biggest challenge on reconciling the need for data protection and the need of AI solution accessing the right compute capacity that sometimes most of our smaller countries may not have access to. One concrete example is that Amazon's nearest data center is in South Africa. I think they're trying to bring something in Nairobi. So then how do other African countries actually cope with that? Isn't that in direct conflict with the existing data protection law? So those were some of the major problems that we did have. The second part was on actually estimating or even starting with what is the best line of AI implementation within the country. So, and the talent available within the country. So even knowing how many jobs that are going into AI or in the next 2 years, 3 years, might be required on the market is a very big complex problem that we're still trying to solve through. The second part is, what are the different sectors where you would want directly AI to almost, I'll say, to have as where solutions could be developed very quickly. I think that's another thing that we had to figure out and say. We did an economic study on where existing AI solutions that are on the market today, which area are they in, and what could be the economic impact for Rwanda with existing solutions on the market. So we did that study, and that was a bit more interesting for us to understand where the biggest impact could be. And starting with, for example, public service, in procurement, in agriculture, in healthcare, in transport. Some of these solutions that exist, how could they come and help us? The third part that I would like to end on in terms of what I could tell anyone else who's trying to develop this, it's very important to contextualize with for your own ecosystem. I think there's also a realization that AI solutions are going to be global solutions, but if we look at how the type of solutions that are coming, it's mostly around going towards a heavy personalization. So personalization of insights, personalization of solutions to individuals. So how do we get to a point where now as countries we can be able to do auditing of models, we can be able to do auditing of data sets, and upscale ourselves. So those are some of the biggest challenges. We did not solve all of them with the policy, but we gave ourselves a clear direction on clear pointers on where we actually need to be focusing on, and some of the things we need to be promoting.
Thank you. It's good to know. You mentioned some countries. I would say that, considering the significance of big data for AI advancement, landlocked nations face a data infrastructure challenge in contrast to coastal countries like Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, and of course Nigeria. So how is Rwanda progressing in establishing robust data infrastructure, enhancing capacity, and attracting the kind of investment to bolster its ambition of positioning itself as Africa's AI hub and responsible AI leader, as you've succinctly put forward to us? And of course that ties into your national AI strategy.
I think at the onset, I think there's also ensuring that at a national level, we actually do have a robust data infrastructure. And here, when I talk about data infrastructure, I actually mostly focus on data sets that are available for the market, if I should say so, and from different avenues. The second part is on where the data is hosted. So we're looking at cross-border data flows, cross-border data agreements with other countries to see how we can then leverage some of the compute capacity that might be existing in other countries for our own private sector mostly. Second, we've been, I'll say, let me call it lucky. We have now a lot of data centers providers who are very interested in investing in Rwanda, and we are attracting and really putting in place the right investment proposals for them to look at Rwanda as a market where they can actually look at, like, come and set up the right data centers and the right compute capacity and infrastructure to run big data. But it's still a very big challenge. The last one I would say is on accessing the cloud, in particular with those data agreements and cross-border data flows and how we're looking at them. And actually recently with Smart Africa, they've recently launched a program called SATA, And it's around creating trust within different ecosystems, so a digital trust within different ecosystems. So one, how can you make sure that your KYC that you did in Rwanda is recognizable in Togo? If they can't do systems that are best in Ghana, how can they do whether they're looking for, whether it's KYC, health records, how can they leverage data sets that are in Rwanda to do the same? And there's a clear trust and infrastructure that is best there. So there's several layers of things that need to be done. But I think on the other one, as a landlocked country, is ensuring that the cost of connectivity is very, very low. And that one is still a very big problem, because if we don't reach to the sea, then so we're looking at different activities such as dark fiber to see how we can get to a point where we actually reduce the cost of data. And then that's even when we're attracting investment in data centers, it actually makes sense for some of the investors. So these are some of the few things that we're trying to do, but also we hope as our private sector grows, there's going to be enough demand and enough impetus for investors to be attracted to set up in Rwanda or near Rwanda.
Yeah. So that's, I mean, you allude to compute capacity, and of course, this issue that I did touch on before about, landlocked nations. It then shows that, cooperation is needed to foster innovation, investments and policy synergies. So how is the Rwandan government, what's the approach of the Rwandan government to partnerships for development, and in what ways would you suggest on the continent the AU can facilitate collaboration, within the continent? And additionally, how can Africa itself collectively engage in global AI governance and policies, as seen in, initiatives like the OECD AI Policy Observatory, or the ITU, or UNESCO, and the Global Partnership on AI? So, you've clearly done some work. So, what are your suggestions to the AU?
I think my clear suggestion is one, we need to have a clear message, or even a clear concept of what the outcome of big data, let me call, for example, on AI, what the outcomes of AI would look like for our own population, for African populations. So what is that? How does the outcome look like? Because then from there, my perspective is that we're able to understand what does ethics mean in the sector. What does responsible? We go on to clearly define what responsible AI. Actually, when you talk to a private company, what does responsible AI means, without necessarily relying on the good conscience of a founder or an investor or a developer in this instance. I think getting down to the granular of understanding what does ethical AI in practicality look like, it's very, very important. Building our own data infrastructure at continental level is very, very important. And lastly, at AU level, harmonizing policies. When you request data from, for example, if you look at a bank, which bank? EcoBank is one of those big banks that has so many branches in so many African countries. There are processes of handling data in one country, KYC, storage, is completely, and even records of cross-border data flows. So for example, if you do transfer of money from Rwanda to Togo, the headquarters of EcoBank, the handling from both sides might be different because of regulatory requirements. So I think here one of the biggest point is to harmonize regulations, policies, but also understanding of these key themes so that when we go into implementation, especially our private sector, they're very, very clear. on what that means at a regulatory point. Lastly, I think collaboration on consumer protection, also at a legal level, collaborating and ensuring that that we're not seeing cracks within the ecosystem on how it should be. So for me, that's my perspective, and I think what at the EU level, what we should be striving for, and really developing the right standards for different, whether it's for models.
We seem to be running out of time here.
Yes,
and
yeah.
you know, I am sure that you and I can go on and on, because this is quite exciting. You know, of course, AI is very topical right now. But if you could spend just 1 minute, just telling me or telling us, sorry, are there specific areas of particular interest to the Rwandan government around, since there's the momentum of innovation is accelerating rapidly. So are there specific innovations that are gaining ground in Rwanda?
At the moment, we're exploring several solutions in healthcare, and as well as in agriculture, and in public service. So those are the 3 areas that we are really ramping up in exploring what kind of solutions we could see and what we could put on the market.
Thank you very much, Esther Kunda. This has been a very exciting session. And you've obviously given us insight and more thought that, the audience and the continent itself will be able to glean on. So I do thank you for your time and your insightful answers. I now need to hand over to Dr. Jude Kong, who is moderating the next session. Thank you, and look after yourself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Ojam. This is Konda. Great work. I like where Rwanda is, and that's where the country should be heading to. And I love that we have this conversation so that we get to learn from each other and understand what is happening in one country, the best practices, so that together we can move as one within Africa. So thank you very much for sharing Rwanda's perspective with us. So we are moving to the next session of our panel conversation, which I will have 5 panels with us. So I'm just going to open up and introduce the panelists so that they call them up and then they introduce themselves. First, we will have Mrs. Nanjira Sambuli, and then we'll have Dr. David West with us, and then we have Mr. John Odopolo, and we have Mr. Rob Ford. So I am going now to start calling them to introduce them, to open the mic, introduce themselves, and then I'll move on to the question, just once upon statement about each of the panelists. And while they are speaking, if you didn't have the chance to send your question to us, please do put it on chat, and then somebody will pick the question up. First, I will call on Professor Olayinka David West to introduce herself to the public.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, or hello from wherever you're dialing in from. Nice to be here. My name is Olayinka David West. I'm the Associate Dean and Professor of Information Systems at Lagos Business School. My core area is information systems and digital transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Next, just following my screen, without choosing, I will call on Mrs. Sambuli to introduce herself.
Greetings from Nairobi, Kenya. I'm Nanjira Sambuli. I'm a fellow in the Technology and International Affairs of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I sit on the advisory body for the Carnegie Council on Ethics and International Affairs, focusing specifically on AI governance. So happy to join you all today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ngolo. I will now move on to Mr. Odopolo to introduce himself, the Director of Stella.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Edokpolo. I work for Microsoft. I'm part of the Corporate External and Legal Affairs team that is focused on the emerging markets across Africa, helping enterprises and governments to actually digitally transform and advising policy makers as well around policies that could also accelerate digital transformation across the continent.
Thank you very much, John. So I will now move to Mr. Flood to introduce himself.
Hello, warm welcome to everyone. Nice to be with you. My name is Rob Floyd. I'm the Director for Innovation and Digital Policy at the African Center for Economic Transformation in Accra. We focus on AI strategies, digital and AI strategies, digital infrastructure, and emerging tech for green industrialization. Very nice to be with you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Floyd. I will now move to Mr. Owusera to introduce himself.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Devi. I'm the CEO of User Labs. We are a consulting firm in AI and data applications. I also sit on the board of CIFER, which is the Center for Artificial Intelligence Innovation Policy here in Rwanda. I'm happy to be here and to be part of this.
Thank you. So in this, ladies and gentlemen, you have made your panelists who will spend the next hours, 1.5 hours, discussing on enhancing development in Africa through big data and AI. And I have a question here that's popping up here for our first panelist, Mrs. Sambuli. And the question goes thus. Big data is critical to development of large language models and various AI tools. But what remains critical is the quality of data and the laws set to guide and protect the use of data with data privacy and protection in mind. Although we have the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, of which only 15 countries ratify it, including Rwanda, Mauritius, Ghana, and Togo, how ready is Africa with the use of AI tools leveraging data? Great question.
Complex question. I guess it bears to start by saying, obviously, Africa is not a homogeneous entity. And therefore, maybe here what we are asking is how Africa, through the African Union, is ready for this. And I think the answer is we're falling short. The Malabo Convention, which is a short form term for the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, was first conceived in 2011. We are now in 2023, and it has only this year received the minimum number of signatures that allow it to technically enter into force, which just means that it is recognized now as a law of the land or of the continent, but still requires each member state to ratify it and align its subsequent or preceding laws around cybersecurity and data protection to this convention. There's a matter that, it was drafted for a time where AI hadn't taken off the way it has. Data protection concerns as we know them today have evolved, privacy concerns as well. How fit for purpose that convention is remains another matter. And how long it would take to get it to be fit for purpose, as we all know, would be quite the bureaucratic endeavor. Therefore, we have a ways to go. Doesn't mean there isn't movement, and doesn't mean that in the interim countries are helpless to do something about it. I think bigger challenges emerge from the fact that what is the defining or the guiding approach that is inspiring how we set guardrails, whether it's laws, whether it's regulations in individual countries, or norms, ethics for those that are self-regulating entities to address this unique dynamic that is our continent as far as data to feed the systems go. Now, you framed it as big data, and it could be argued that it's not necessarily about big data, which tends to be about voluminous amounts of data. It is about that quality data. It is about how we go about quantifying our complex world and whether the methods that are used today scientifically capture these complexities. How are our own scholars thinking about how we can better quantify to build the ones and zeros that we need to feed into the systems? These are just as important questions before framing it as whether big data, the absence of it, the presence of it on the continent, which fields that is relevant, which fields it will not help us, and where we actually also buck the trend with what we see in the Western approach to developing these tools. All these remain very important considerations and discussions that should be happening and are happening in strides. The question is how in concert they help us, sort of come up with an African position or a, series of African positions on how to proceed.
Thank you very much for the brilliant questions. We heard Mrs. Konda said earlier on about how they are ensuring that in Rwanda, the data is locally relevant to Rwanda. If they bring any AI tool, it is locally relevant. You just talk about not just focusing on the quantity of the data, but ensuring that it's quality data, locally relevant. This is very vital. Otherwise, we end up with tools that do not represent the people that it's supposed to represent and end up with solutions that do not represent the communities that it's supposed to serve. Thank you so much. So I'm going to move to Professor West. And the next question, Professor West, is there are various frameworks or templates to utilize in developing AI policies. You have the UNESCO template, you have the EU Act, the Beijing Artificial Intelligence Principles, the US National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Act of 2020. But what is critical is the creation of a baseline for African context and ensure human rights and ethics are highly considered. How should the African Union approach this? And this is speaking very much on the quality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think as a business school professor, and Lagos Business School is one of the business schools that was created from inception 32 years ago, teaching business ethics. So part of this whole idea of embedding ethics and thinking around ethics in business in any vertical form of management has always been integral to what we do. And from the ethical perspective, just looking at a lot of us, we're blinded around what we want to see and what we don't want to see. And there's ethics in everything. And there's moral dilemmas in everything around our choices, our decision frameworks, and different solutions that we present. So even as an IT manager, do I choose solution A or solution B? There are ethical considerations there, because so what if I say, oh, I'm buying a solution from John. John is my friend. I'm already imposing a bias in that decision framework. So what AI is doing is that it's just sort of putting everything that we're already doing as human beings on steroids and taking it away from us and out of our control. So how do we ensure that we're representing everybody? And there are different ethical frameworks, overlay ethical frameworks on top of technology development practices, technology implementation practices, then you begin to see the nexus and all the different areas that we need to focus on. So from an African Union perspective, I think Ms. Kunda, Nigeria have spoken around this. We have to start with, first of all, first principles, foundational principles. Let's take stock of who we are, what we have, and let's begin to understand that from our own context. You see, all the policies and all the frameworks that exist have been designed for those contexts. And don't forget that from a technology readiness and adoption perspective, we're still not there yet, right? We have, when you look at indicators like the Network Readiness Index, we still see that our government services are lagging. So how do we start to build on top of, use AI to build on top of principles that should already exist? So I think we need to, as policymakers, start to have conversations around some of these things and, coming to the table, not just to have the conversations about policy, but I think most importantly is monitoring, evaluation, and learning, right? We push policies out there. What happens to those policies 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line? How do we learn and continue to evolve our policies? So I think that the AU should think around frameworks around digital transformation, use of different technologies, but most importantly, monitor, evaluation, and learning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well said. And the key words stood out here, which is what we need to consider: ethical, our choices, bias, the monitoring and evaluating whether is representing the population. You always go back and feedback when that happens, which is very, very vital. And this to speak to nothing about us without us. That saying is very important. You hear everything about equality, nothing about Africans, nothing about our community without our communities. Could I speak to it? Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to John. And John, the question for you goes thus: the report governing AI, a blueprint for the future by Microsoft, highlights the importance of applying system safeties, a well-established discipline that has been used in various sectors, such as aviation, automotive, and nuclear, to the engineering of AI systems that control critical infrastructure. How can governments promote system safeties without hindering innovation? And what is Microsoft doing to support these efforts? Thank you. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Let me just make sure that I'm not, one of the recurring features of these hybrid meetings have been, you're on mute, take yourself off mute. So thank you very much for first of all, the organizers for inviting me to come be part of this panel. I'm just hoping to learn, and I'm learning a lot already from all the previous contributors and panelists that have spoken ahead of me. I think AI is something that has excited all of us in recent times, mostly because of the advances that have been made, I think, in the field of generative AI. And we're seeing a lot of excitement online around some of these conversational applications that are out there, like the ChatGPT, Bard from Google, and Bing Chat from Microsoft, and all of that. So it's really instigated a lot of conversation. But this has been, this is not new, but it's just a lot of the advances that have happened recently has gotten all of us excited. And as a company, and I think everybody here can attest to the fact that there's a lot of promise, with some of the applications for AI solutions out there today, whether it's in the field of governance, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in medicine, aeronautics, you name it. My CEO is always talking about the fact that AI, or this era of generative AI that we are entering, it's going to be as important to human development as the age of the internet. Some would even say, if you look at the way that the printing press was able to accelerate civilization, not just economic development, that this is what this tool has the potential for. I think we're just scratching the surface. Nobody knows exactly where this is going to end up. We have use cases for it today, but where it's going to end up, how far it's going to go, nobody can really say. And I think that's part of the reason why people are understandably cautious around so much benefit, but what about the downsides? Is anybody thinking about the downsides of how this is going to impact jobs, for instance, or the safety implications? Are robots going to take over our agency as human beings? Not to talk about what the potential for bad actors out there in the cyberspace have to be the kind of tools they have at their disposal and their motivations to use this technology actually for harm. And I think that's where this whole discussions around, first of all, not more broadly around AI ethics, like Professor has talked about, in terms of not just what AI models can do or what technology can achieve, but what should it be doing and how should it be doing that? How should we be using it? That's a lot of the sphere of ethics, but we're also talking about more practically around safety measures that should be put in place for a lot of these systems. And that's what the blueprint that you referenced, Doctor, the Governing AI, a Blueprint for the Future that Microsoft released recently. It was sort of our own contribution to the public sphere to say, okay, we know that AI development and AI use should be regulated by government. But how should governments regulate this? How should governments be thinking about it? And we've put forward certain suggestions around that. And one of the main pillars is around safety. The fact that AI systems need to have safety built in by design. And when we're talking about safety, we're talking about those systems being reliable, those systems being subject to human agency or human control, or the ability to be able to maybe shut them down when they're behaving in certain ways that they shouldn't be behaving. And this is something that, like you said, well-established principle in a lot of spheres out there. My president typically talks about the safety brakes that you put that was built in for elevators, for instance. Today, a lot of us take elevators without even thinking about it, or not even understanding the mechanics behind it, going on 50-floor buildings and up and down. But something happened for us to become comfortable using that technology, and how it has revolutionized urban planning. And it's the same kind of reasoning we're saying should be put in place for AI in terms of baking safety features into the development of this solution. You talked about what are we doing and how should governments be thinking about it. I would say for us, for instance, and when I say us, I mean Microsoft. We're talking about some of the things that we've done. Over several years, over the last 6 years, we've developed what we call an AI responsible AI standard, which is basically a set of systems and procedures and policies that guide the way we develop AI solutions internally and how we use it as well. And that's something that is being contributed to and being monitored constantly. We have over 350 professionals across multiple fields in the in-house in the unit, looking at responsible AI use, responsible AI development and AI use internally. We have red teams that are constantly troubleshooting, testing, trying to make sure that for every system that is being built or every possible use case, they are trying to determine what are the potential harm, how do we measure that, how do we mitigate that, so to speak. But I think for governments, there are standards out there that are already being developed. I think one of those that comes to mind is the NIST artificial intelligence risk management framework out there. And that is something that we are encouraging governments to adapt. It's a baseline standard that governments across the world can adapt in their countries and put in place, build that into procurement rules for AI systems, make sure that even for public enterprises, these are things that they apply, both for the suppliers of these technologies and for the consumers of this technology as well. These are things that they're going to be baking into a lot of their processes. And those are the kind of things that we should build on as well. You know, I know Professor Yinka talked about something about us losing agency and control. And those are some of the fears that are out there for the use of artificial intelligence. But what I would say is that the technology has a lot of benefits, and we can't stifle that by saying no. Because if you do that for the good guys out there in the field, in the realm of cybercrime, a lot of the other actors that do not subscribe to government laws are going to develop it anyway. I'm going to use it. So we're saying, let's not hinder that, but let's make sure that we are now thinking through policies and standards for safety in terms of the development and the deployment of the technology as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I love how you hammer on responsible AI solutions. And by responsible, I want to break it down. We want to ensure that it's accountable, it's auditable, it's compliant, it's ethical, and you speak strongly to this and echo the previous speakers. It's respectful, it's safe and secure. Thank you so much for hammering on all of this. And I'm glad that Microsoft have come up with this framework, and everything boils down to our communities, ensuring that this is safe for our communities, responsible for policies, responsible to solve the issues in the communities that's supposed to serve. Thank you so much for bringing this. And this will land me on Mr. Rob Floyd, because you talk about this responsible AI and ensuring that it's very responsible and the governance of AI. Mr. Rob Floyd have been advocating for digital transformation agenda for Africa. Really applaud you for this. That leverages big data and AI, leveraging the asset report on artificial intelligence for economic policy making. Can you kindly share some key highlights on how governments can utilize big data for policy making and how African governments and regional organizations create policies and actions that support and enable this agenda? Thank you.
Of course, thank you very much. And again, it's a real pleasure to join you all. Yeah, at Asset, I mean, we're a policy institute, an economic policy institute, and ultimately our key objective is to help African governments ensure that they have better informed policy that leads to economic transformation, not just economic growth, but transformation of economies. And if we look at AI, as has been mentioned numerous times by other speakers, AI applications are now quite widely utilized in education and health and in agriculture and transport, et cetera, but less so in economic policymaking. And here particularly, we're looking at fiscal and monetary policy. This is a frontier issue, even for the global north, but we know that those tools are coming. Right. So our objective is how can we help African ministries of finance, African central banks be prepared to utilize those tools in the future, even if they're not able to do so now. And those tools could be used, for example, to inform interest rate setting. Right now, we know that generally when there's a change in interest rates, it's based on data that is 6 months old. It's based on mostly government data. It's based on data that may not actually reflect what's happening in an economy. But we know that utilizing big data and actually even creating new data that isn't being utilized now can better inform those policies. So whether that's interest rates policies, whether that's battling inflation, whether that's nowcasting for economic policy, tax rates, for example, would be a very good one. Where right now, tax rates are generally very broad, and kind of throw a tax rate at a segment of society and hope people pay their tax. It could be much more targeted if we used the big data that is available. And this would all mean that the policy could be made faster. It could be better informed. And importantly, and this goes back to the responsible and ethical issues, if we're using public data, new data, that can be put on a blockchain, be made public. We know it is secure, we know it's trusted, and that can create transparency in government policymaking. We've all seen the situation where a minister just decides that a policy will be put in place, there'll be a new tax rate. It happens without much transparency or understanding of what goes into that. What governments can do or need to do, and I would say it's governments and all of us, all of the stakeholders, whether that's in the private sector, whether that's in academia, whether that's in civil society, et cetera. One is having a better understanding of what these tools can be. And here Asset is in 2024, will be undertaking a number of regulatory sandbox exercises with African governments, and this is a partnership with the Africa Forum on Sandboxes for Data and the DataSphere Initiative, to help governments understand what is the potential and how can this actually be used, and going to Esther's point about how to ensure that it is completely contextualized to the local situation, whether that's the languages that are used, whether that's how the data is selected, et cetera. The second is ensuring that policies in place. This has already been discussed in some depth. We know that most countries are well behind the ball on this. The AU, as has been noted, is quite slow. There is a working group chaired by Egypt. Asset is a member of that, but it doesn't meet very often. Out in NAPAD is advising on the AI policy, but I think there's some capacity limitations there. And importantly, we believe that this needs to be done as a partnership with the private sector, because the solutions will largely come from the private sector. So that ecosystem needs to be there. And the ecosystem needs to include science and technology universities, building those skills, et cetera, as Esther had also noted.
Thank you so much, John, for hammering on, and I love that you talk of locally relevant data responsible data and talk about AI governance. And you brought in one key point here, which is on the application of AI on fiscal and monetary policies. And by talking of responsible AI, just to remind everyone, we have talked about responsible AI, what it means, and local. What John means here is ensuring that AI solutions are autonomous, caring, connecting, decolonized, human and community-centered, inclusive, intentional, intersectional, just, practical, protecting, process-based, and sustainable. John, I couldn't thank you a lot for bringing all of these up. So I'm going to move on to, sorry, it's not John, Rob. I couldn't thank you a lot for bringing all of this up. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, which is our next panelist, Devi. Sorry, and Devi, as the CEO of Jojer Labs, Rwanda and Kenya, you have been developing AI solutions, and I totally believe that you'll be ensuring that it's responsible, it's locally relevant, and it's explainable. And for various sectors in Africa, such as agriculture, health, education, and energy, impressive. I think if I were in the forum, I would clap for you right now. What are some of the challenges and successes that you have been encountering in your work?
Thanks, Jude. I hope you can hear me well. Can you hear me well? I just have to confirm. Thanks for the question. I want to divide this into two categories. So we start with like the technical challenges and then the business challenges. Then I move on to the success after that. So I think my colleagues have started talking about different challenges that we've seen in the industry. And if you're venturing into AI industry, one of the main challenges that you should expect is actually data, like the rest have been talking about. Although that I wanted to sort of like, move a little bit deeper than what we touched in line with data. So apart from the volume and quality, as we talked about, there's more to that. There's basically what we can call from our industry bias. So this is a scenario whereby you sort of like have data that has been maybe adopted in other countries, or you have models, or you have systems that have been adopted in other countries, but are not necessarily applicable in Africa context. And if you are someone who is Africa first and building solutions for Africa, you actually meet a scenario whereby you have sort of like models or solutions that can be adopted in Africa, but depending, maybe it could be even open source, because as you know, maybe you don't have to, recreate the wheel, reinventing the wheel. But you find out that actually there is sort of like, a bias. We've seen that. And this sort of like, brings us down to how do you actually tackle that? How do you make sure that you build on top of what's available out there in, be it academic industry, be it other industry, but also, bring it down to the Africa context. So bias has been one of the challenges that we actually have seen in the AI industry. Although we're talking about AI, we're talking about so many different things. I think a couple of months ago, I was presenting to Africa AI, which was a conference that was happening on with AI, and I was showing how even the large language models cannot understand a few things like USSD code, like in Africa. And we use USSD code every time. But because it's Africa context, it may not be necessarily, Western context where these kind of models have been heavily trained. You find out that you have to, again, retrain these models, and you have to be very careful when you're applying these kind of techniques, be like transfer learning and so on, to make sure that actually those models can fit in Africa context. So that's one bias, which is of course data, quality data. How do we make sure that we have representative data in different use cases? You're talking about computer vision here. You're talking about natural language processing, where you have applications like ChatGPT. So you talk about different things here, whereby you have data, but out of data, which the one that is open source is actually like representing like Western context rather than representing the Africa context. And we've been passing through that, and of course, when you spend some time in the industry, you keep on working on solutions create data, and so on. But there's another challenge that we have encountered. We often meet some of the clients that actually require certification for AI systems. And if you're building systems like this, you actually have to find your way through to make sure that you have your systems reviewed by other people. And interesting enough, some of these certification actually come from these other companies, a bit like iBetter or NIST, that actually also have data that they have to sort of test your system using data that also is Western context. I remember like 3 years ago, I was advocating how we can bias, for example, like face recognition models in Africa. And this was more of like KYC industry. So if you look at like, for example, like KYC industry is booming, whereby if you want to open an account in the banking industry, you don't have to always present yourself there. So you have to, for example, open a web, and the web is going to take your selfie, and we're going to analyze if it's not someone holding a picture of you in the front of the camera, and there you're applying AI for like anti-spoof. And once that is done, we have to, for example, like, assess if the first we're seeing is probably the same first we're seeing on the authority side, for example, right? So if that is happening, then you need something certification. If you're going to go for certification, something for like models like that or AI systems like that, then you're going to go for NIST or iBetter. And if they're going to test you, they're going to use Caucasian faces. And you are Africa first, like your models have been trained for African faces, like millions of African faces, and you're being tested against like Caucasian faces, and they are like different features, be it vision and so on, and like pixel values that you can find in there. So you find that yes, data is the first step, but it's also after data you also find out that most of the open source models they really don't take Africa into context because of data as well, because created data is not available. But again, when you move past that stage, you also get into certification, which is still into Western context, not African context, and that creates a lot of things that I'm going to cover on the business side. So, and I was discussing with some bodies. I think was last year where I was discussing like how can we have actually Africa Fast AI system certification, right? So if we have to certify that the system is ready for a specific task in AI, be it machine translation, be it computer vision and so on. Why can't we have systems and organizations in Africa that can create data, which is Africa Fast, that can actually do the certification? Because that sort of like helps throughout the way in line with the entrepreneurship. So business category challenges, which also comes back and interchange with what I was talking about in line with data and cost and so on. So while AI is still booming, and also it'll be like we need a lot of work to do in that sector, but also other sectors in line with systems and software, they're not fully mature in sub-Saharan Africa. So you find out that some of the challenges that we've met, like pluggable solutions, whereby you only focus on AI, and maybe you provide like APIs where people come and plug in, it's not yet widely adopted enough. There are some solutions where it's adopted, but not widely adopted in Africa. And you find out that most of the work, or most of the business that is there, it has to be full package. So you have to do the AI work, but on top of the AI work, you have to build systems. You have to make sure that you actually do the architecture for the whole thing, the whole solution. And then you have your AI that is in there, but to make sure that it's sellable to different solutions, to different clients, and can plug into different solutions, it has to be full package. And this comes with high cost. If you need like human resources for like AI scientists, you also have to hire like back-end engineers, you have to hire front-end engineers. So that is like another challenge that I've seen. It's sort of like gradually getting there, whereby you see that pluggable solutions are coming, and you can probably, if you're focusing on AI, you can just focusing on AI. But can't you just focus on AI? You have to do front end, you have to be ready for back end. So it's like double cost that is sort of like coming for entrepreneurs that are actually venturing into AI solutions. So yeah, we quickly move on into the success part. I think one of the success which I can believe that is shared across organizations and different companies and institutions, be it public and private, is the adoption that we are seeing nowadays. So we're seeing adoption, and we're seeing like different institutions embracing AI solutions, and that is very great, at least for the recent years, the pace that is taking. I would say that is like, the main success that we're getting here. So we've seen adoption in the health sector and computer vision of use cases like medical imaging analysis. We've seen applications whereby like AI is helping like demand forecasting, for example, like application like blood donation in the health industry. So there is like telemedicine adoption that is coming in, which is quite tremendous. We've also seen adoption in actually, like use cases that would not have, I would say like would not really think that AI could have reached there very fast. But we've seen adoption, like for example, in some smart cities, like clean waste, like cleanliness enforcement in smart cities, whereby like AI is used to make sure that you can avoid like collection points overflow, and make sure that like waste does not overflow to do like drainage blockade, which leads to like water logging and so on. So there's like adoption that is coming, that is making it possible for someone who is investing in AI and an entrepreneur in AI to actually do things that are going to be impactful, and things that are going to actually plug into different other solutions and demand that is in the industry. As you know, if there's no demand, it's very hard to actually become innovative. And even education, I think we've talked about some of that. We've seen adoption, kickstarting like partnership with like Olympiad, mathematical Olympiad to do like machine translation in local languages for like math savvy kids in the country. There's like adoption, and adoption is one of the things that I would think is the main success that we've seen in the AI industry in the recent years.
Thank you so much, Davey. You have emphasized and strongly echoed the previous speakers on bias. You have talked about knowledge transfer, and you have talked about, you brought in one new aspect that had not featured, which is unexplainable AI. And I want to just talk about this explainable, and you speak strongly on, by explainable, you mean equitable, fair, interpretable, reliable, reproducible, transparent, trustworthy, and unbiased. So we have now heard on 3 key things that an AI framework for Africa should adopt. Responsible, we have heard about this from all speakers. We have heard about it being local, and now another concept have been introduced, which is explainable. Thank you so much, David, for bringing this. I want to take a question from the audience, and the first question comes from Adiola, who asks, how practical is it to drive these policies, regulatory frameworks from an AU level, given that there are varying contexts at country level within Africa itself? So I'm going to leave it open to the floor, but as everyone is getting ready, I don't know whether Mrs. Sambolaka, you can try an explanation to this, while others, please do tip in at some point and add more to this, or Professor West.
Sure, I can go quickly. I think at this point, there's a version of an African Union that exists as this imaginary of what we need as a people, as a bloc. And then in instruments like the Continental Free Trade Area breathe to this idea of a new age, a digital age where the African Union is this new imaginary of what we need to actually give us a bargaining power in the market, the global marketplace. So that in itself is what is driving a lot of this push to do stuff at an African level or African level. How practical it is, obviously, we have the example of a Malabo Convention and the fact that it can be, in fact, a lag. a real practical challenge, obviously, is how much sovereignty or how much power individual member states cede to the African Union to do anything on their behalf. I mean, this would ideally be one area in the digital economy where some negotiations, some deliberations, some guidelines could be done at a continental level, sort of like, or, you know, individual countries in the African Union could figure out a modality through which they negotiate and work in lockstep. Because in as much as we are in different stages as a continental, you know, different countries, there are still some aspects where globally we are still lagging behind in that regard. And therefore, and we have this unique perspective that sometimes transcends across our borders, and that still has merit in having this space go. So it's very much a political issue. Over and a bureaucratic one, over and above the technical matters at hand. But there is opportunity. I guess hope springs eternal.
Thank you so much. I am going to thank a lot for the brilliant answer. And I'm going to move on to Rob to answer the same question. Rob, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, we are working with the African Union and the European Union on some of these questions, particularly around the digital single market and digital infrastructure. And I think we just need to be realistic in one sense that it's a bit of a matrix, if you will. On the one hand, you have the African Union that, yes, ideally provides this broad framework and the conventions that drive policy and so forth. But the reality is, at the same time, governments are developing individual policies at the national level and so forth. And then I think it's very important to remember in this context that, you know, particularly in areas such as AI and innovation and so on, the private sector actually goes ahead and creates the environment, if you will, in many instances, even in a vacuum of policy. So if you look at mobile money in East Africa, right? I mean, this was an opportunity that the private sector took advantage of. If we look at the use of drones in Malawi or other countries, the space was given for them to experiment. So I think we just need to be realistic that all three of these systems are working at the same time and will work at very different speeds and levels.
Thank you very, very much, John, for sharing your experience, policy. So Rob, and then John wants to react to this. John, over to you.
Yeah, I think I like the way you keep ascribing Rob's very brilliant submissions to me, and I just adopt them.
You are taking credit for Rob's work. Rob is presenting and you're taking credit, John. You need to pay.
I mean, yes. So I know where the person that asked that question is coming from. As a company that plays across Africa and supporting enterprises and consumers that are across many of the countries in Africa and who are also looking to do business across Africa, I think a lot of the times it can be very frustrating when you're having to respond to multiple regulatory requirements. A lot of the times disjointed. So even though the African Union and the African countries, we don't quite have the kind of framework that you have in Europe, like the EU, for instance, and the kind of binding force that a lot of those European EU policies have on the countries, even though each country still has to adopt those policies. But I think the African Union can play a very big part in, first of all, convening power and taking the leadership in a lot of this policy innovation that can, even though it acts as at best, how do I put it now? It acts as best as something that is suggestive to the countries, but I think it can signal for the continent where the policy direction should go and how countries need to leverage these frameworks and these policies and regulations for their own country. The AU has the incentive through a lot of its bodies to create an open market across Africa, to create one market, to create business, to drive trade, innovation across the continent. So whatever policy they bring forth at that level should have some kind of effect on the policies that are coming up in the countries, because each of the countries might put on blinders and just focus on their territory, but it's one market. It should be one market. The digital market is one market. And they should actually be leaning on the AU for more of this leadership in terms of this kind of policy innovation. That's my humble submission on that.
Thank you so much. I am going to move on to the next question, which is from Gillan, who is, I must proudly say, the director of the Global Artificial Intelligence for Pandemic and Epidemic Preparedness and Response Network in Ethiopia. And Gillan asked, when it comes to regulating and implementing policies in relation to AI, infrastructure and expertise play the most important role. What is being done in relation to these two critical perspectives in Africa by governments in Africa, Rwanda government, and by the tech companies, e.g. Microsoft? And in case anyone can take this question, but I think, John, if you want to take the lead to answer this while others speak on, that would be great, from Microsoft perspective.
Yeah, I can take a stab at it at the beginning. I don't know what Gillan means by infrastructure, whether he's talking about technological infrastructure on the ground, like data centers and stuff like that. But yes, I think, first of all, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, let me just level set. Artificial intelligence, and adoption of artificial intelligence, then talking about regulatory policy to sort of look into that or to govern that. This is an offshoot of digital transformation. All right. I know that the CEO, Huzalab, was talking about bias in a lot of data sets that are out there and stuff like that. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of these highly capable models that are out there are being trained on data that is publicly available and freely available on the internet. I don't think a lot of those model owners or developers are looking to exclude an entire continent of 2-something billion people. It's just the data of information or data that is out there. And a lot of the time, that is because there is of the low adoption of digital technologies, where you're able to harvest your data or be able to have data sets available, or even Africans contributing to open data sets or models out there in the world today. So that's just the truth. A government need to, first of all, adopt digital technology for their own governance and for their own use, and also need to spur, first of all, adoption of digital technologies, digitize their economies, then spur research and collaboration from the academia and from NGOs, and then collaborate with private companies to contribute to these data sets, because the truth of the matter is that when we talk about artificial intelligence, a lot of the people are going to be having the experience of a lot of people with artificial intelligence will be at the application model, at the application level. So people just using applications that have been created for them for their productivity or whatever it is, whether even for better search, all right? But when you go below that and you're talking about models, there would be companies, governments that will be using models that are already out there and layering their own data on top of that to create their own applications, And then when you're then talking about going below that level to have models that are being developed by companies or countries, there are very few people that are going to be playing at that level, and not everybody is necessarily going to be playing at that level. So that's my introduction to this, to the answer. But when I talk about what we are doing at Microsoft in this space, talking about capacity building for regulators, capacity building for academia, capacity building for NGOs who do some of the best work in this field in terms of research, in terms of putting technology in the hands of the underserved out there to be able to use for their own economic betterment. A few of the things that we're doing, I don't know, recently in April, or rather in July, we launched this our AI skills initiative. That has two aspects to it. One of it is creating this free coursework and professional certification for generative AI, part of our skills for employability, because when we talk to a lot of the governments, they're talking about employment for the huge youth population. So that went live, and those trainings are going to be running for free through the course of 2025, for people to be able to have access to the skills that they may need for some of the jobs that are out there. But another level of that is also a grant that is going out for NGOs, academia, for research into best use cases for generative AI, as it were, or how to train people for adoption faster. So that's there on the one hand. We're also talking about giving free access to our own foundational models to academia. And there's a process for them to be able to apply for those, to have access to those foundational models to, first of all, for their own research, but also to test it and to certify some of the findings and make them public out there. So that's some of the things we're doing in terms of capacity building at Microsoft level.
Thank you very much. And then I'll be calling the professor and then handing it over to my colleague, Nina, to continue the moderation, but I'll pass it over to Professor to address the same question, and then Nina will take it from there. Over to you, Professor West.
Thank you very, very much, Judah. I think I just want to chime in. And for me, the question we should be asking ourselves as Africans and as representatives of our own nations is, how do we leapfrog our digital readiness era to actually get into this AI era? Because we're not there yet, as John rightfully explained. So my question now is, we also our governments need to understand the era that we're in, an era of competitiveness, right? How do we start to take these things a little bit more seriously? How do we start to implement? Rob talked about the sandboxes. That would be a fantastic idea, because there's a lot of testing and learning to be done. But I think for me, I'm just the impatient optimist that, okay, when do we start doing these things? What's the feedback loop and the cycles that come back? Otherwise, we're just going to continue having conversations very upstream in the value chain without really saying, how do we take it down market? How do we put AI in the hands of the farmer so that he can make better choices and better decisions around the crop he's going to plant? He can improve his own livelihoods, because those are the solutions we need now. And unfortunately, yes, they're happening in very, very small segments now. But then again, we need this thing to be at scale. So how do we build these things and put these things together so they can scale? Africa has a very young population. It has a growing population. And so the odds are against us, so as well as the good sides are really for us. So how do we bring these together to ensure that we can actually put ourselves on the map? The models don't represent us. And that has been the case in every situation. Look at pharmaceutical industry. So it's nothing new, honestly speaking, but it's really about, how do we get in the game? How do we start to participate? And how do we sort of leapfrog these models and these errors and really do what we need to do for the betterment of our own societies and cultures? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor David West. This also, I'm going to channel this question to Davy. From what Professor Inka David West have shared, like, how do we position ourselves? From a private sector perspective, I mean, according to Goldman Sachs, over the long term, AI-related investment could peak as high .
Yeah.
I'm not sure
Is
if I'm
it
the only one
me
that's
or
having challenges.
you're breaking a little bit? Oh,
yeah, it's
okay.
breaking. It's
So
not just me.
I think it's breaking. Okay.
Yeah, we lost you, Joseph. If you can hear us.
We're in Africa, so we have to be patient, right? And he's frozen again.
Maybe you take off your video and just use the audio. Joseph, if you can hear us.
Okay, I'm back.
Lost. Oh, there you go. Okay.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
So Justin, Joseph, maybe you take off your video and you just audio if it's a bandwidth.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay, I think that will work. Yeah. Okay. So taking up from what Professor Yinka David shared earlier, I just wanted you to come from a business standpoint to sort of see, I mean, Goldman Sachs, according to Goldman Sachs, over the long term, AI-related investment could peak as high as $100 billion in the US alone, and then 200 billion globally by 2025. And we know that 400 billion globally is EU and mostly China and some parts of Asia, and Africa in that small, within that small percentage. But how, from your own standpoint, how should Africa position itself for these opportunities?
Thanks, Joseph. I think when I ended my the answer that I had for the last question, I was talking a little bit about AI adoption and capacity building, talking about initiatives in machine translation of mathematical questions into local languages, so that we can have kids adopting the some of the concepts that may not necessarily be easy to understand due to barrier language. And this sort of comes straight to this question that you're asking into how are we ready. I think capacity building and talent development is comes at the front of this. The way that we incorporate this into our educational initiatives, and how we build our society to make sure that they have the awareness of what's possible and what can be done in these sectors. So I would start by saying capacity building and talent development. Then the creation for innovation hubs. So there are some that are being created, but I think innovation hubs really hold a very important, a vital importance for this kind of push to make sure that we are ready for AI and how AI is coming in for the next few years. For example, in Rwanda, there's Noskin. So I give a little bit of a perspective of how this is really very important. So if you developing solutions a couple of years back in some of sub-Saharan Africa, we really had to actually do the solution. The solution makes money, right? And then when you start making money, you start employing people and you start expanding and so on, which is really very different from how the AI companies are being built. If you look at the Western model, whereby you actually get the investors put in money, and then you can actually get access to the right skills, and you can start deploying solutions and so on. But if you start building these innovation hubs, you start actually getting access to that capital, whereby you have solutions, AI-based solutions, whereby you have investors investing in startups fast, seed investing and so on, and they can start working on these solutions so we can be ready for the investment and all these opportunities that are coming up. So the last one I would end I would sort of conclude this by talking about forecast applications. So I think we need forecast applications, because I see, I think one of our colleagues was talking about we're in the era of competition, and there's no difference from the AI perspective. So if we want to be competitive, whereby we have African companies and organizations that are going to sort of be in this area of this industry and actually excel in the AI solutions, we need to make sure that we have forecast applications. But by talking about forecast applications, there are solutions that are particularly best for Africa, and that actually has to start by going back to what we were talking about, by creating data that is actually Africa fast, that is going to help us to leverage whatever problems that we have that we can solve in the African continent. So I think focused applications with specific needs in Africa, that are Africa first, that are actually looking into what Africa is facing in this area, and what Africa wants, could help us to actually even be more competitive into like the kind of like applications that to build with AIs. So I think capacity building, creating innovation hubs, and having focused applications would be really very ideal to make sure that you're ready for AI boom that we're experiencing.
Perfect. Over to you, John.
Okay, I just wanted to add something to what he said, and I totally agree with him. But because but suggests as if I was going to say something contrary. No, I was going to add that for the study that you were quoting from Goldman Sachs and what the ripple effect or economic growth that's going to be driven by artificial intelligence, that growth is not necessarily coming from, say, the technology stack. It's not talking about growth in technology stack. It's talking about a lot about the productivity that adoption is going to drive, the efficiencies that is going to drive, and stuff like that. So a lot of the AI policies for the countries and the continent should focus on several aspects. There's capacity building, of course. And by the way, when I talk a lot with government officials, and when they're talking about capacity building, a lot of the time they're just talking about skills to enable those that are out there in the workspace today to get jobs. Because that's what they're talking about, employability. But they're not talking about the skills that are inbuilt from true education. They're not talking about rejigging the educational curriculum through primary, secondary, to university. They're talking about STEM. They're not talking about how, because a lot of the things he talked about just now, when you're talking about creating specific solutions for Africa first, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean creating large language models that are Africa focused. All right, because you need something that is scalable across the world, you know. But you're talking about ability to be able to even take some of the models that are out there, or take some of the services that are already out there, and building applications on top of that is going to serve African problems, as it were, and will drive adoption across the continent. And you really, for capacity building, we need to start thinking of policymakers beyond the unemployed today or the underemployed today, and thinking about how do we build a set of people through the educational system, through STEM, that are going to be innovators and creators and not just looking to have jobs. Otherwise, we are not going to drive the right kind of development or acceleration. I want to say development, I'm talking about economic development across the continent that we are hoping for. I just wanted to add a bit of that.
Yeah, I think Professor David West wants to add as well.
Yes, I think for me, it's chiming on to what John said. It's really about thinking across the ecosystem. And when we're even talking about the supply side, how do we intentionally start to mitigate some of the challenges we're seeing today, like bias? So also, how are we ensuring that the teams that are building some of these AI systems also employ diversity, equity, and inclusion policies? Otherwise, we're just going to be perpetuating the same things, and then we will now get into this problem. So funding is coming in, but then again, we need local funding sources, because those hubs need to be sustainable. And then how do we start to think about building diverse teams? So we talk about gender and bias. How do we remove that? We talk about skin color and things like that. So we also need to think around these things and build global solutions that are scalable, and start to put these frameworks or these building blocks in play now. So as we're building, we're not having to come and self-correct, but we're actually building on. Thank you.
Breaking up again, Joseph.
Yeah.
Still on capacity, right? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Am I audible? Okay,
yes, we can hear you now.
Perfect. Okay, so there's this question, an interesting question at that. So AI will definitely replace human labor. I don't know if I agree with that yet. In different sectors, okay. Is preaching the AI gospel in Africa detrimental or beneficial? Not forgetting the high unemployment rates and how underused the youthful population in Africa is. This is from Evans Ochieng from University of Nairobi. I mean, there was also this data from a professor from Harvard that also talked about this as well, saying that technology needs to be very, very inclusive. Most of the time, it's not inclusive. So most of the growth we see is not an inclusive growth. So I don't know, maybe I'll direct it to, yes, exactly, Professor Inka.
Well, I put my hand up because on the economic side, I tell my students, economics always wins, right? So if you think about it, we used to deliver letters with horses many years ago, right? Today, what do? And the bottom line is economics will always win. So for me as an African, it's really going back to what John said. How do we use this thing to drive productivity? Yes, there's destruction of some jobs, but there's creation of a whole plethora of jobs. How, again, leapfrogging, how do we start to look into the future and start to prepare ourselves for that future now? So we're not always having to catch up. And I think for me, Africa is at a good position because we have all the tenets to do this, but it's now, how do we implement? How do we get these things going? And how do we fire it across all the 54 markets? And I think institutions like the AU can help because we all have different levels of capacity. How do we combine forces to ensure that we're not repeating things and we can actually leverage the best of everybody, build our principles, and then help each other through toolkits, through mechanisms to implement those toolkits in the different markets? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Rob wants to take a stab at it. Go ahead.
Yeah, just, I mean, I completely subscribe to Prof's position here. I mean, we know from history that technology will create more jobs, but I think for the African context, we sometimes talk about AI for AI's sake, and governments and business leaders and so on need to think about, for example, if you take the green industrialization potential of Africa with all of its natural resources, a young working population, etc. So how do we leverage AI and other emerging tech to support that new industrialization of the continent? So I think that's the connection that we often don't think about. But while there may be some job losses, I think over the medium term, there's no doubt that these new emerging technologies will create more jobs, not fewer.
Yeah, I don't know if I can add a funny anecdote here. My CEO Satenadela talked about. There was this one time he was at I think it was at the UN, was talking to some official who had like a personal assistant there that was taking notes, like a stenographer, right? And so they were talking about the same, because this whole talk of job loss started with digital transformation and even cloud solutions. So he was explaining to them about cloud solutions and about the kind of adoption or digitization that it was going to drive. And he was talking about, well, maybe there might be some job loss, like repetitive manual labor, and then referenced and said no offense to the person that was there as a personal assistant taking the notes. And the personal assistant said, oh, no, I'm not concerned. IBM said the same thing 20 years ago, and I'm still here. Well, I said that to say this. A lot of the solutions that are out there today, and that a lot of companies like Microsoft are going to be looking for, will be solutions that increase productivity, take away manual, repetitive, time-consuming tasks, but make you more productive, as against looking for something that's going to replace humans. I don't think we are there yet, and I don't think that is something that any technologist is going to be looking to drive. Sure, there'll be some job losses, but I don't think it's going to be at this wave where people are talking about.
Okay. And Nigeria, you raise your hand.
Yes, and it's maybe because at the risk of over answering a question, there is also the fact that we do need to be very wary of this AI doomerism that is around. And there are different actors with different motivations driving it. And so for the continent to adopt a narrative that is not, sort of like grounded in the realities of what we're facing would actually be very irresponsible, both by the, whether it's policymakers, whether it's, AI evangelists or others. This has to be very important. And we have to tie it back to just the age-old stuff. There are a lot of what's driving AI is also, bits and bobs, infrastructure, materials, minerals, and all of that, including the kinds of circular economies we need to create, because as more and more technologies are being developed and being dumped, we need to figure out e-waste and all these other things. There's a very, sort of 360 picture we do need to paint about where AI fits in it. So rather than trying to advise governments or other actors to sort of adopt technologies, to think about it in the big picture of where are we, where is every country in its journey, and where is AI, whether it's adoption from the consumer side or application side, appropriate, but most importantly, how does it figure into what you already have as resources, whether it's commodities, whether it's your industrial realities today, to make sure you don't lose sight of it.
Thanks. Davey wants to take a stab as well.
Yeah, I'll be really quick on this one. So I think I look at this as, yes, you could have two effects. One, some of the jobs could be lost, to be frank. But I also look at this as like maybe like job distribution shifting, kind of. That's where I see like a lot of like effect of AI coming in, whereby you could see distribution shift depending on where AI comes first and where it comes next. So I think to me, that's how I'm looking at it. But as my colleagues have been talking about it, I think there's a whole lot of like multiplier effect you can see into this. So as AI comes and increase productivity, as John was talking about, and Andrea. So there's a whole lot of like value that is actually created, and when value is met, and there's a whole lot of perspective that we can look at. So we're also looking at, if value is met, there's like more taxes that are coming into places, depending on what kind of policy that you're putting in place. There's, more like government expenditure that could be sort of like oriented depending on whatever value that is created. So if you look at it into one channel, as my colleagues were talking about, then there's a lot to worry. But if you actually step back and look at a whole lot of 360-degree view, you actually see that there's value that is going to actually be created. I think maybe as we look into this, maybe in Africa, we also have to look into how we can put in place the right policies that could help to make sure there's not like income, like the like extending or maybe expand like in income inequality distribution. So we have to make sure that we can actually put in line some policies that can make sure that smooth a little bit of how do we make sure that actually for each and every sector there is that adoption that makes sure that actually we sort of like smooth out a little bit, like the income distribution. I think if we do that right, AI will create more value than actually harm. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so most of these things everyone has shared. It requires collaborations, devising proper policies and guidelines. But then again, the question remains, how should this be achieved with? So let me come from Nigeria's perspective, because I know she wrote an article on multi-stakeholderism. So multi-stakeholder initiatives are promising, but they most meaningfully include everyone's voices. But what's critical is, how do you ensure that everyone's voices are included? So because, for instance, now if you come from a private sector perspective, private sector has the money and their voices are usually louder. Then if you come from a perspective of communities, there is always a gap. So how do we bridge that gap and ensure people's voices around, especially from maybe smaller NGOs and all of that. Their voices are included in the development of AI technologies or application tools and all of that. So I think I'll start with Nigeria first.
Sure. So multi-stakeholderism has sort of been the rallying call for how to govern technologies and globally and across different spheres, sectors and all of that. It does have its pitfalls, obviously, and that's why I wrote about it, just to make sure we don't lose sight of them. Now, typically people read those kinds of points and then say, okay, so let's just throw our hands in the air and forget about this thing. But there's still merit to try and get it right, because I think to the heart of it, it's really this calls for multi-stakeholder governance go back to the questions of governance. And I think governance in what democracy has always promised itself to be, that coming back to the fore becomes really important. And the way to think about it is, if, say, your government is trying to use an AI-assisted model or automated decision-making, for example, that will have implications for a community or communities, it stands to reason that those who are going to be affected should have been involved in the consultative process leading up to the adoption of such a tool. What typically will happen is maybe there'll be a tick box measure kind of consultation, or quick, public call for public participation, put in the newspaper for next week, and then that those tick box measures are what make the process cynical. But there's work ahead, and I think this just really does tie back to how we govern our societies, and technology is really challenging us about how much progress we've made towards making sure people's voices and views are included across the board.
Perfect. I don't know if there's anyone that wants to take a stab at that, but if not, would want to ask one question for everyone. Starting with Microsoft. Oh, Professor.
John, let me just quickly add to that. It's just really about focusing on what problem we're trying to solve, because private sector, NGOs, everybody comes at it from a different perspective, and private sector has its own interests, NGOs. But if we're really looking at solving Africa's institutional and societal problems, multi-stakeholderism can work. So it's not any party. It's really about focusing on the problem we're trying to solve, and realize that there's not one way. There's going to be trade-offs made. But if we're focused on that problem and genuinely interested in that problem, then we should get along. Thank you.
Okay. I want to end on a beautiful note. So I want to start with Microsoft. So we have various institutions here. So from Carnegie to Lagos Business School to Africa Center for Economic Transformation, American Business Council, Nina Jojer here. So one question is very critical: research. So what is Microsoft doing in Africa to support research, and how can institutions that I mentioned work with Microsoft to drive research on the continent?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that. I think as a company, and if you look at the blueprint on governing AI that was referenced at the beginning that we put forward, there is no way to make progress in this sphere without collaboration with NGOs, collaboration with academics, for research, so to speak, and private entities. Research in the sphere of responsible AI, ethics, impact of the technology, possible perils, how to measure these perils, how to mitigate against these perils and stuff like that. So and that's one of the things that we, as a company, we've committed to, first of all, to partner with governments, partner with academic institutions to convene these conversations. As it were, we've done a lot of that in the past, and it's something we're also looking forward to do in the near future, because we don't want government to have knee-jerk reactions to policy adoption and implementation. If you say, apart from the EU that has an AI Act that under consideration, a lot of countries are having principles espoused at this moment. They're having, a lot of them have principles, because they are saying, okay, we're trying to understand what's this technology, its potential impact. These are some of the things we want as of today, and they're taking that approach because they want to understand the technology, understand its impact before you make more substantive regulations. So, and academia plays a big part in being able to convene a lot of those conversations and looking into those issues. So that's one of the things we're looking to do, partner with academics to convene these sort of conversations. I mentioned earlier as well how we're giving access, and I can share how that works, giving access to academic institutions to our foundational models to be able to query it and also to use that for some of the research that they are doing in the sphere of particularly generative AI.
Perfect. So if we come to Microsoft, to you directly for research, you will support. Thank you very much.
Why not?
All right. Thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists for accepting to participate in this session. We look forward to working with each and every one of you for prospective on-ground sessions, actually. Yeah. And thank you to our participants who shared their questions and participated in this session. We look forward to engaging you further. So this webinar is recorded and will be shared, and the report also will be shared with everyone. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.